And with that, welcome to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. My name is Rob Luzinski, and I'm the community coordinator at the Stewardship Network. We're going to start with a few introduction slides, and then we will get right into the presentation. So a little bit about us. TSN is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-plus year history. We are now serving 30-plus place-based TSN member communities and fiscally sponsored projects across the Great Lakes and the country. And in addition, many TSN programs, like the one that you're experiencing right now, are available to everyone. Our mission, we exist to connect, equip, and mobilize nature's caretakers. So I'd like to dig in a little bit deeper into those various aspects of our mission now. We connect. Through decades of collaboration, we've become a nexus of vital stewardship knowledge, and we're committed to sharing it widely. Equip. We remove hurdles so that stewards can pour more energy into their ecosystems and into their communities. And mobilize. In supporting nature's caretakers wherever they are, we amplify collaborative stewardship efforts here at home and nationwide. So now I'd like to get into a few examples of these different pillars of our mission. First, we will start with Connect. And of course, we are so excited about our conference coming up next week, January 22nd and 23rd. It is one of our favorite times of the year, and we are so very excited to host you all once again for our next conference. And we have some big news. We have sold out. For the first time in 19 years, the Stewardship Network Conference 2026 is completely sold out. This year, there will be no walk-up registration and no waitlist for tickets. And we really appreciate your understanding because we have not experienced this before. So we're doing our best to be respectful of folks. And we know there's a lot of people that might want to join that are not able to. And we are very sorry about that, but we are also very excited and appreciate this moment of growth for us as an organization. And we really appreciate everybody that was able to support us by purchasing a ticket. We truly appreciate your support, and we're ready for a high energy gathering. It is going to be a magical time, and if you're not able to join us this year, we very much hope that you will join us next year. Next, Equip. Speaking of conference, we have an opportunity for you to get gloves at conference. Our Gloves for Good program has now delivered over 52,500 pairs of reclaimed work gloves for nature's caretakers. Make a request on our website by end of day today. Today is the final day to request your gloves if you are attending the conference, and you can choose the new limited time option, fulfillment and impact, or under fulfillment and impact, for free delivery at TSN conference. We will bring them to you, and you can take them right home from there. You can see there an example of how that will look on your form. And if you're not going to the event or if you missed the deadline, we're always taking requests for free local pickup or USPS shipping. So you can feel free to make your request anytime using the options, the general options that are available to you. And lastly, mobilize. We are very excited at another representation of healthy growth for the organization. Please welcome the Green Ribbon Initiative, which is our newest TSN member community. We are so excited to welcome folks from the Green Ribbon Initiative, some folks that we've had a working relationship with for a really long time, and they're taking care of a really special area within the Midwest. Stewards of land that the Nature Conservancy has named one of the 200 last great places on Earth. That is pretty remarkable. The Oak Openings region of Northwest Ohio and Southeast Michigan. It is truly a special place to be, and sometimes I know for myself that you can take it for granted, and it's really nice to have folks that are out there championing the amazing ecosystems that we are so lucky to live in. So thank you again to the Green Ribbon Initiative. We're so excited to have you. And lastly, if you'll be there for day one of the conference, you can join Green Ribbon Initiative's own Maddie Watkins and Peter Blank for their presentation at the conference this year. So we hope that you will pop into that presentation if you get the chance. And with that, I would like to welcome our speaker today, Elena West, who is the Applied Avian Ecologist with the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And today's presentation is Ecology of Red-headed Woodpeckers in a Threatened Ecosystem, Insights from a Long-Term Investigation in Oak Savannas. Elena, if you would like, you can start sharing your screen. And thank you again for being with us today.
Looks like, oh, there we go. So you get to see my desktop, my messy desktop for 1 second. Sorry about that,
You
everyone.
are brave. You are
I gotta
brave to
work on
share.
that. I start teaching again next week, so I'll work on that before my students get back to class. So it's really wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. I love getting to share a little bit about this species and the work that I've been doing for a while. So I'm a faculty member in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota. The work that I do would not be possible without support from largely the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, which we have here in Minnesota to support a lot of really amazing work. My collaborators at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve and the Minnesota Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. Also, I've received a lot of generous support from local Bird Alliance chapters, Audubon chapters, the University of Minnesota, and individual donors. So just want to give a big kind of shout out to those folks. The work just wouldn't be possible without a big collaborative effort. So thank you. And it's also really exciting to see people here on the webcast from Wisconsin, Michigan. I did my PhD in Wisconsin at UW-Madison, and I did my master's at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And so it's just I'm making the Big Ten tour, but it's really fun to see you all here. So I think we have a lot more in common than we do not in common. So thanks for being here. Um, so kind of just to jump right in, there are here in Minnesota, which is kind of where I'm going to center most of the work today, or most of the talk today. So we have 9 woodpecker species that breed and or winter here in Minnesota. So I imagine a lot of you are bird people. So you probably know if we're starting from the upper left, we've got our downy, our hairy, our pileated, our northern flicker, our red-bellied woodpecker. We've got our yellow-bellied sapsucker there on the middle right, black-backed woodpecker, red-headed woodpecker, and then our American three-toed woodpecker. So a little bit of a kind of a mini quiz there today. Among these, red-headed woodpeckers are really the only species here in Minnesota that's been in serious decline for many years. Red-headed woodpeckers have a pretty large range across much of the eastern half of the United States and into some parts of southern Canada. Their breeding range is, I'm showing that here in kind of that orangey color and purple. The purple areas also include areas where they winter. And then, so populations throughout North America have shown pretty widespread declines over the last 50 years or so. Birds are still commonly, seen throughout this range, but populations have really declined such that you might only see an individual or a small number of birds rather than larger numbers, which was more common historically. In Minnesota, red-headed woodpeckers have experienced an average annual decline of about 6% since the late 1960s, and this represents a cumulative loss of about 95% of the population, probably due to the loss of much of their preferred sort of oak savanna or open understory habitat. Here in Minnesota, they're designated a species of greatest conservation need by the Minnesota DNR, and they are a target conservation species by Audubon, Minnesota. So in North America, oak savanna originally amounted to about 50 million acres from southern Canada all the way down to Texas. And much of that original habitat is gone, given, although much of that habitat is gone, given the historic range of red-headed woodpeckers, which extends much beyond that original extent, they don't appear to be exclusively tied to this habitat. So I just like to point that out. We kind of refer to them as this keystone species to oak savanna habitat, but I think And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but based on the work we're doing here, I think they really can exist in other types of habitat as long as there are some other things that are present in that habitat. So they're not exclusively tied to oak savanna, but historically they were. Um, in Florida, in the southeast, I know we find them in like pine plantations and things like that. So it's really interesting that they are somewhat generalist in some ways, but in other ways they're more specialist. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So it's estimated that here in Minnesota there were 5.5 million acres of oak savanna here pre-European colonization. So that was about 10% of the state. The DNR, other land managers like the Nature Conservancy estimate that less than 1% of that original extent remains, mostly in these kind of small isolated blocks. In 1985, apparently their surveyors could only find 9 sites in the state that had meaningful blocks of oak savanna. So anywhere above like 35 acres. So they're really, really tiny blocks here. And I put an asterisk there because the source of this information is from a 1985 paper by somebody named Victoria Nuzzo that's now archived in some conference proceedings. But it's been really hard to track down that sort of easily accessible data on what our, current extent really is. So it's something I'm working on. So we know that in addition to oak savannas, red-headed woodpeckers breed in pretty wide variety of habitats, as I mentioned. So we find them in woodlands, river bottoms, orchards, sometimes golf courses and parks. They might be seen, sometimes in agricultural areas and along forest edges. Um, and there's this common theme that I sort of alluded to earlier. It's this common theme among these different types of habitats, and that's this relatively open understory. And the presence of dead or dying trees, which I'll refer to as snags a lot in my talk. So um, we also need live trees and shrubs, probably mast producing species as well. This picture was taken at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, which is here in Minnesota, where I do much of my work. We have a lot of oak savanna there. You can see in this picture, in kind of the foreground, there's snags, and then in the background, there's a lot of live trees, live oak trees. Oak savannas, if you're not familiar, they're this kind of mosaic ecosystem or transitional ecosystem between forest and prairie. So they're not really forests, but they're not really prairies. They're somewhere in between. And this kind of mixed habitat, it provides red-headed woodpeckers with both nesting and foraging habitat. So this species excavates nest cavities and roost cavities, so where they sleep at night sometimes, in dead and dying trees. And that's a lot easier to do as trees decay. So that's just kind of like setting the stage for what I'm going to talk about today. Red-headed woodpeckers are also one of the few woodpecker species that forages for insects by fly catching. And that means, just sitting on a perch, flying out and sallying or capturing an insect that's flying by. So an open understory allows them to do that much more easily. When we think of woodpeckers, we often think of them as species that drill holes in trees to grab insects or sap. And this species actually doesn't do that. So it's something that people don't often know about red-headed woodpeckers. So I like to share that. This species will also sometimes drop to the ground from a perch to grab an insect, a grasshopper, a beetle on the ground. And one thing that we've seen not only at Cedar Creek, but in a few other places is that they get hit by cars a lot because they're doing this type of foraging near roads. And obviously they didn't evolve with roads. And so they'll be flying down or spending time on the ground searching for insects along the sides of roads, and then they'll get hit by cars. So that's one thing we see every year at Cedar Creek that has been pretty difficult to manage. So a theme among some of these habitats that where we find woodpeckers is ecological disturbance. So that's an event that causes mortality to plants and animals, changes their spatial patterning on the landscape. Disturbance, as I'm sure a lot of you know, comes in many different forms, natural or prescribed fire, thinning of trees, mowing, grazing, disease outbreaks, wind or flooding damage. We have a lot of evidence that red-headed woodpecker presence or density even is correlated with habitats that were recently disturbed or are regularly disturbed, either by these natural processes or through management efforts by humans. In the case of fire as a disturbance, there's a lot of data to show that our national strategy of fire suppression that began in the early 1900s has really resulted in forest bird declines throughout the country. And these policies, of course, protect property, but at the same time, they threaten these fire adapted animals and plants and ecosystems. And that fire really, it really plays an important role in savannas because it removes that shrubby undergrowth and it renews grassland plant species while leaving some of those hardier species like bur oak, and then speeding up the decay process for some of those less hardy trees, which actually this, really comes into play with red-headed woodpeckers, which I'll talk about in a moment. So, red-headed woodpecker ecology and behavior, they nest in these tall snags and they have to nest in dead trees or dead branches on live trees. They're a cavity nester, and there can be this sort of aspect of their life history makes them kind of difficult to study, which I think might help explain why we don't know as much about them because you have to get up very, very high sometimes to access their nest cavities. And so it takes specialized equipment, a lot of time to do this. And so that's one of the things we've been able to do pretty successfully at Cedar Creek, thankfully. And, over the last 200 or so years, the species has really gone through this kind of boom and bust cycle with periods of seemingly great abundance, and then also scarcity, when they appeared to be on the verge of extinction. And so there's some thought that this may have been related to the loss of American beech forests that happened. And today we have some evidence to suggest that they're associated at least with large scale variation in the abundance of acorns. And that's another thing that I'm studying. I don't have time to talk about that today, but I do think that there are some correlations at least there. So for the last 8 years or so, I've been leading research on red-headed woodpeckers. The majority of that, as I've mentioned, has taken place at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, which is a reserve run by the University of Minnesota. It's about 35 miles north of the St. Paul campus here in Minnesota. But I've also collaborated with researchers at the University of Toledo in Ohio to do some comparative work at sites in Northwest Ohio and Western Michigan. And that work, that specific work, we're still, we've added some components to that study. And so I'm sad that I can't share details about it today, but maybe you can have me back in 6 months or so or something or a year, and we can talk about the findings that actually include data that were collected in Michigan and Oak Openings Metro Park. It's a really interesting study. So specifically, the goals of my work really are to identify the habitat needs of this species, to add to our understanding of woodpecker ecology and behavior, and then use our research findings to support habitat management and restoration efforts, both on public land, but also there's a lot of private landowners that want specific information about what they can do on their property to support this species. So the focus of my work has really been on understanding the kind of the components of savanna habitat that support nest site selection, nest success, fledgling survival, and then aspects of their behavior, specifically really related to how they use habitat throughout the annual cycle. So migration, but also how they use breeding habitat. Where do they go? How big are their home ranges? Things like that. Just basic aspects of their life history that will help us kind of understand the whole picture about this species. So, um, this sort of collectively, this information, my hope is that it'll help us determine this sort of specific information about how or what kind of habitat they need during both the times that they breed, but also the times when they're overwintering. Again, to get a kind of more complete picture of what they need during their annual cycle, which is, I think, more useful from a conservation perspective, and a restoration perspective because just understanding one sort of season in their life history isn't always as helpful. So we're really trying to get a more holistic picture here. So just to give you a little bit of a picture of what we do in terms of our methods, we're very lucky at Cedar Creek that many birds are at least a little bit habituated to coming to these platform feeders that we have, and so we start baiting them in the spring with peanuts, and they kind of figure out that they can come and get a peanut and then leave and be fine. And then we gradually introduce a potter trap, and we leave the doors open for a while. We put uh, peanuts in there, and then eventually we set them so that they can be captured. And it's a really, I've been working in avian ecology for about 15 years, and it's a pretty great way to capture birds that, it takes a while to get them habituated, but it's pretty easy once the system is in place. So that's how we do it. And we put those feeders, generally we figure out, where birds are in terms of where our mated pairs on the landscape. And then we can kind of target capture. Each bird we capture is marked with a unique combination of color bands and a USGS, like a bird banding lab metal band. And these are so we can identify them as individuals using binoculars later on. We don't have to recapture them if we don't have to do resighting data collection. I mentioned the sort of fancy equipment that we use. For our nest monitoring work, we use a nest camera that's can be raised on a telescoping pole. Those poles can reach up to 40 feet in the air, and then put into an active nest to photograph the cavity contents, which is really, really helpful for understanding how many nests survive, how many eggs there are, how many nestlings there are. So we get pictures like this. We see, anywhere from like 1 to 7 eggs at a time. Usually the average is about three or four, and generally 2 to 4 eggs hatch, and about 2 to 3 nestlings will go on to fledge or leave the nest. So we get a lot of pictures like this with our nest camera, moving from sort of clockwise, starting with eggs, or counterclockwise, starting with eggs, and then our hatchlings, and then nestlings. And we do typically daily nest checks during the breeding season to capture data on brood size, brood reduction, nestling development, survival, and then the timing of fledgling so we can do our data analysis. We have a pretty elaborate setup to access these cavities. You can see this. Really, the only way we can collect the kind of data that we need on the cavities themselves and the nestlings is to access the nestlings. And I was very, very lucky to have 2 volunteers who really led this effort of putting up a ladder and climbing dead trees mostly. It is not for the faint of heart. And they cut portholes into the trees right below the nest cavity so that we can get our hands in there and access the nestlings, and then process them and put them back right away. Over the years, we've seen no difference in survival rates between nests with portholes and nests without portholes. I want to say that, which is really good to know. The adults don't seem to be bothered at all. And this was done on just a subset of nests each year. So I'm going to transition into sharing some results that I think a lot of folks who are in the restoration world might find interesting. I kind of targeted this talk at some of those interesting details. There's a lot to share, but in like 40 minutes, I can't share it all. So, just to share some preliminary results related to nest site selection. So, what kinds of areas are birds selecting, or what does the area around nests look like, and what are they selecting for? So I call this like the habitat scale. This is the area right around the nest. We collected data within a 10-meter radius around nests that were used, and then trees, areas that were not used. So we did kind of a use availability design. Um, so we looked at a number of covariates that we thought might be important in predicting the sites that red-headed woodpeckers choose for nesting. And so this has, really important implications for people wanting to do restoration efforts on the ground, like girdling trees, cutting trees down, killing trees in other ways, introducing fire. Um, so we looked at the number of live and dead trees around those nests, the understory vegetation, what that was made up of, our canopy cover, or like, how thick the canopy was essentially, and then whether distance to water or distance to forest made a difference. Um, and I can go into more details maybe later if people have questions about the hypotheses here about what was kind of driving these. But these covariates really came into play because of what we already know about the species and their life history. So our nest site selection results really show that indeed that sort of density of dead trees or snags around nest trees is important. And that's this figure that I'm showing here. So our y-axis of the plot, that's our relative probability of use. And so that which shows that given this plot shows that a given relationship says that as we increase x, how does that change the relative probability of a woodpecker using that tree for a nest site? So for dead trees, for example, we would interpret this statistically significant positive trend as the number of trees, dead trees within 10 meters of a given tree increases, the probability that that tree was used as a nest also increases. And it's a relative probability because we're not able to calculate a baseline selection rate. We don't know the total number of trees at Cedar Creek that are used versus not used, because that would be basically impossible to figure out, or it would take you a very, very long time. So what we also did was calculate the odds ratios for the effect of dead trees on nest site selection. And odds ratios are really just a handy way to interpret our model, and they tell us the likelihood of an event occurring. So that's nest tree selected in a treatment group, which is dead trees added, versus a control group where there were no trees added. So with an odds ratio of 1.2, the odds of a nest being selected increase by 20% if we add a single dead tree to within 10 meters. If we add 4 dead trees, that doubles the odds of nest site selection. Adding 6 dead trees triples the odds of nest site selection. So this is just really, I think, pretty compelling data to share with the public, but also landowners, land managers who are interested in restoring or creating habitat for this species and perhaps other oak savanna specialists that, might need dead trees, for which there's a lot of secondary cavity nesters that can't create cavities themselves, but rely on cavities from that are created by primary cavity nesters like red-headed woodpeckers. We also found that increasing woody understory increased this relative probability that I've been talking about, which I think is super interesting. And these, again, are preliminary results, and we haven't published them yet. But, my thinking here is at Cedar Creek, we have a lot of Corylus americana. We have a lot of, it's hazelnut. in our understory. And I think that this might be driving these results that, they are a mast producing species. So, and we have seen red-headed woodpeckers foraging on hazelnut. So I think that this could be one of the, really compelling pieces of this particular study. So I also want to talk about some results related to the level of decay that we found in selected nest trees, which also has important implications for management. So here I'm showing a cross section of a red-headed woodpecker nest cavity that was in a tree that fell down. And I had a volunteer who cut this crosswise, and you can see this cavity is really deep. They average, I think, 24 centimeters deep from the top to the bottom. It's about 9.5 inches. And they're pear-shaped, which is also super interesting. Probably that's, if you think about predators on the landscape, raccoons, other, rodents, other larger birds can't get in there. We have seen raccoons reaching their arms in on, trail camera videos that we've put up, and they can't get down there. There are a couple species that can get through these holes. They're about 2.5 inches wide, so they're very small. But flying squirrels and snakes, certain snakes can get in there. And so I think those are probably the two species that are having the most negative effect on nest success. And those results are coming in a bit in terms of publishing. So, but in order to create, the point of this is that in order to create a cavity like this, the wood has to be pretty well decayed. And so we were really interested in understanding, is there enough like dead wood essentially on the landscape? Is this like a bottleneck essentially for, creating available habitat for this species? So, so what we were interested in this question of what proportion of the dead wood on the landscape meets this threshold of tree decay that we found in our research. And so I'm going to show you a kind of cool figure. So nest trees that we measured are in red, and available trees are in gray. And so on our y-axis, this is the like a measure of wood hardness essentially, and it's measured in a unit called Newton meters. It's really interesting. And then on our x-axis, we have distance from the bark surface in towards the cavity. So if we go to this picture, if you look, we're going from like the outer edge of the cavity inwards, and you can see a very big difference between trees that were not used, that's our gray, and trees that were used. So they get really, really soft on the inside, and then a little bit harder as you're, around the edges, which is super, super interesting. Um, and so while dead trees are good, only 13% of the dead wood on the landscape at Cedar Creek is soft enough for nesting. So when we think about, giving guidance to landowners, we can tell them that the best level of decay are the trees with the most decay relative to the others. Essentially, that's that sort of like top 13% of the distribution. Um, but I do think the important finding here is this is, tree decay or wood softness is probably a limiting factor on the landscape. And this has really important implications when we think about creating habitat. It probably means that we need to have a lot more dead trees and trees that are in varying levels of decay on the landscape. And so, these results are, I'm obviously prepping these now, but I think that would be like one message I would send out to folks is just thinking about having trees in varying levels of decay if you're targeting species that need dead wood in order to create cavities. So I'm going to transition to kind of insights we found related to the trees, the specific trees we found inside of those home ranges or territories. Home ranges are just the area where an animal spends most of its life. That's where it finds food, where it rests, and in some cases raises young. It's kind of like their neighborhood. You can think about it that way. It doesn't always defend all of that area, but sometimes we talk about them as territories. Redhead woodpeckers are very territorial, and so they actually defend all of their home range, which is really interesting. And so they tend not to be super, super big, largely, I think, because they have enough resources inside them and because we have lots of other pairs of birds around. So there's sort of this like shrinking when you have enough food, you have enough resources in terms of trees, and then there's other birds around, you're only going to be able to defend a certain area. But so what we did, and sorry, these are kind of small, hopefully you can see them, but we named a lot of our woodpeckers. So you can see their names. And I let my field technicians do this. It's easier often to remember names versus numbers. We try not to anthropomorphize our study species too much, but this is kind of a fun way for field technicians to kind of get a little closer to the species that they're studying. But these are home ranges that I'm showing of pairs largely. And you can see male female pairs are essentially right on top of each other. Um, and some of them are really, really close to one another. But I had a very, very intrepid undergrad who worked for me a couple of years ago. His name was Theo Carlson, and he did an independent project for his degree. And he went out and he measured every single tree within each home range for every bird that we had radio marked in 2023 and 2024. So he measured, I think, over 1,600 trees to species over, I think, a period of about 7 months. And he recorded whether they were dead or alive. And all of this is kind of a part of this holistic perspective that we're trying to gain about, what's important for this species. And so what he found that interestingly, all home ranges had at least one bur oak, which I find fascinating. One of them had only one, but one of them had 342 in it, which is a really big range. I think it makes sense that, bur and northern pin oaks and red oaks really make up the majority of the species, because this is what's mostly available at Cedar Creek. We do have a lot of other tree species, and they will nest in these trees, as you can see on this histogram. But largely, our oak savannas and some of the areas near the oak savannas are made up of these three species. But going back to the decay results, I don't actually think that it matters what the species is. I think it really matters what decay stage they're in. So as long as the tree is decaying, a red-headed woodpecker can probably access it from an excavation perspective for creating a nest or a roost. Bur oaks are really fire resistant. They have this thick, kind of corky bark. And so when fire comes through at Cedar Creek, which it does regularly, Cedar Creek has the longest running prescribed burn program in North America. It's been running since 1964. So every year fire comes through a lot of the different areas in different frequencies. But it is a pretty regular disturbance on the landscape. And so those bur oaks are fire resistant, but they'll have dead limbs. Red-headed woodpeckers can nest in dead limbs, but those northern pin oaks and those red oaks, those are not as fire resistant, and so they die or they're damaged, and so that decay process starts and it sort of is sped up. And so I was talking about fire earlier, and I think that this is really one of the more important findings from this work and in thinking about how this might apply to other landscapes, is that it really probably doesn't matter if they're bur oaks or pin oaks. It matters that they're decayed trees. And then, of course, having that open understory. And I think the reason there are bur oaks inside these home ranges is because they're mass producing. And this species needs insects, but it also needs acorns, particularly if they're going to overwinter, which they sometimes do in Minnesota. They're facultative migrants, meaning that some years they migrate, but some years they overwinter here. If any of you have spent any time in the upper Midwest, you know our winters are pretty cold. So having a cavity to keep you, sort of relatively out of the elements and food, you're going to be okay. So I think that that's probably what's driving that bur oak result. But yeah, just wanted to share that. And then also thinking that those results kind of are supported by Theo's result, where it looks like 73% of the trees within these home ranges were alive or mostly alive, meaning they were at least 50% alive. And then 27% of the trees within these home ranges were made up of dead trees. Um, and so I think, this is really interesting because of the previous results I've mentioned in terms of snags. Those are so important for nest success, but live trees are probably equally important for foraging. Um, and so, again, I think this is another reason we need to study not just the breeding season, but also when they overwinter, thinking about future studies and understanding, what they're doing and what they're eating is also important. So this work is again preliminary. Theo and I are working on publishing these results, and I'll be excited to share those publications with you all. I know we're kind of running towards the end here. A question that I get sometimes that I want to touch on is oak savanna restoration scalable? Cedar Creek, the oak savannas there are about it's pretty small. It's something like 250 acres. And so it is manageable from a management and restoration perspective. I think my short answer is yes, that oak savanna restoration is scalable. I think um, the techniques we use at Cedar Creek, fire, selective tree removal, snag retention, these are being implemented in a lot of other places. Probably many of you have worked on this. And red-headed woodpeckers respond quickly to these restoration efforts, which I think gives us some hope. But I think that the caveat is that it's probably harder for long distance migrants that are losing their stopover habitat in other countries. Animals like aerial insectivores that are dealing with pesticide-driven insect collapse, or grassland birds that have, these increases in agricultural intensification. So my hope is that red-headed woodpeckers aren't the exception, but I think we also have to think about addressing the systematic issues, or sort of the systemic issues facing migrants and insectivores, not just on the breeding grounds, but throughout the full annual cycle. But I do think there's hope. Habitat limited species in manageable ecosystems can recover when we give them what they need. Waterfowl, I think, are a really important poster child. There were massive declines in waterfowl that were reversed through really strategic habitat conservation efforts, the Duck Stamp Act, CRP lands, wetland restoration. I think that's an example that I love to talk about. It gives me a lot of hope. And there are partners, funding mechanisms already in place, NRCS programs, state wildlife grants, prescribed fire cooperatives. There's a lot of work happening to restore oak savannas and to restore ecosystems that I think we have momentum. And so it's kind of a both and issue. We've got, it's really hard, but there is hope at the same time. So I'm going to end there. I imagine there might be some questions. I do want to thank the amazing research technicians I've had over the years. I've worked with just some really incredible people that I'm showing here. And also my sincere thanks to the many volunteers that have helped on these efforts throughout the years. And Caitlin Brawley Potter at Cedar Creek for her kind of endless support. Um, if you are interested in supporting the work, please, do so. I have a Z link here. This bird ecology fund we've set up to support this research in my lab. A lot of our work is supported through just lots of small donations. So anything helps. Um, we are hoping to continue this work into future years. I think keeping tabs on this population is really important. I think it is kind of a model for what can be done, not only here in Minnesota, but also throughout the Midwest. So I'll end there and hopefully I can answer some questions for you all. Thanks so much.
Thank you so very much. That was great. Lots of good questions here. And I encourage anybody out there in the audience to submit your questions if you have them. And we have a few here that I would love to start getting to. So, one question here, and it's kind of a clarification because you may have touched on it, I believe, but is there any clear indications of the type of tree preference for the woodpeckers? I know you were talking about the relation between the tree species and the decay rate, but I'm just curious. There's a few questions there about if there's a clear indication of preferred tree species.
Yeah, I don't think that tree species matters. I think that what matters is whether it's decayed or not. So in the species range, we actually see red-headed woodpeckers in the southeastern part of the United States, and we find them nesting in conifer trees. I can't remember the exact species. I think there's a couple different species that decay faster after disturbance or death. And so I think throughout their range, we'll see, we see them nesting in lots of different types of trees. It really just matters whether the tree is decaying or not and is dead.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Another question about one of the preferences that you had mentioned. So, from Jeff, is it possible that preference for areas with shrubby understory might be more related to insect production than mast production? Timing
Mhm.
of the breeding season and mast availability, late summer and fall, strike me as having minimal overlap. Thank you for your talk. Very informative.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That's a great insight, great question. I think that it's hard to tease apart the answer to that with the data that we have. If I could go back in time, I would probably design a, s- a side project or a study to also look at insect abundance or insect foraging or something along those lines to try to get at that question a little bit more. Insects are super, super important. You're right for the breeding stage for nestlings. They have a lot of protein, and so they're sort of a preferred type of food to feed nestlings. And so, well, indeed, woody understory could be related to that as well. I had the same idea when we added the distance to wetlands covariate into that model. I thought, well, maybe because we have some ephemeral wetlands in our oak savannas and we're near a pretty large lake that has a marsh around it, I wonder if that might contribute to that as well in terms of insect abundance. But wetland distance to wetland did not make a difference in the model. So that also could be a function of us not, sometimes you don't know how to answer the question with the data that you have. And so you have to think about collecting the data differently. So, super great question and insight. But I think we're not exactly sure yet why that woody understory is important. So, it'll be good fodder for the paper when we write it.
It's always good to learn about the questions to ask, even if you haven't
Absolutely. Yep.
necessarily always answered them. Yeah, that's great.
Yep.
Thank you.
It's part of what makes research really fun too, and important, I think. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. So we have a question here about the decline of the woodpecker. So Becky asks, I am wondering if you have thoughts about why the red-headed woodpecker has declined so much in the last 50 years, since I would guess the most significant habitat loss likely occurred between European settlement and the mid-century.
Yeah, I think that actually agricultural intensification and development of, suburbs and ex-urban areas probably intensified more in, the 60s and 70s here. We did a lot of, ag of cutting down forest and savanna with, when Europeans came and colonized these areas, but I think that a lot of the intensification of, for development has actually really happened in the last, even 20 to 30 years. So I think that that habitat loss is really what is probably has probably driven this species to decline so much in, over the last 50 years or so. I also think the fact that we suppress fire, we have a lot of forests and habitat that is not open, doesn't have an open understory, so there aren't as many places for this species to, both find the dead trees that they need and then also forage in open areas with open understory.
Mhm. Great, thank you. So now there's a couple questions on kind of the management side. So Jim asks, we lose a lot of excellent snag candidates to removal for oak wilt management and perceived threat to park users. The proliferation of trails for different uses exacerbates this. Is there a best practices resource or class for city park foresters or arborists?
That's a great question, great insight. I'm once I get a couple of these publications out the door, my goal is to also develop a best management plan document or, sort of couple pager for land managers and even private landowners. I think thinking about it from that sort of government level is interesting because, there's this balance that we need to strike between public safety, right? And not having, snags can be really dangerous. And so I've thought about could a guiding principle be really around creating areas of parks where people are advised not to go because there are more snags there? Or can we have sections of park that are maybe off limits to people? Or at least where trails are separated from areas that where snags are being maintained because of that sort of danger, so to speak, because if a snag falls on somebody, that's really, really awful. So, I think we do need to strike a balance there, and I think having parks or areas, natural areas where snags are being created or left to decay further, but where the public maybe doesn't have access is probably a balance there. I'm not sure, and from the Jim, you're probably more of an expert on that than I am and how something like that could get done.
That's great. Thank you very much. Maybe one more question or two more, but from Lucas, we have a question. As a land manager, we are often managing for the habitat, for example, oak savannas, as a whole, rather than individual species like red-headed woodpecker. Are there any oak savanna or oak woodland management actions that have a negative impact on red-headed woodpecker populations that should be avoided?
Ooh, this is a great question. Um, we might have to have a side conversation. I'm not exactly sure at this point. I mean, I think, you know, from my studies that I've done, I think having that open understory is really important. And so at least having some areas with an open understory, we tend to let forests just kind of, if we're not managing them, they kind of, the understory just grows up and then they're not really usable by oak or woodland species. I mean, obviously things like insecticides and pesticides come to mind as things, if we can avoid those, I would avoid them so that there are enough insects. I know that that's not always possible, but obviously doing targeted, um, insecticides or pesticides where needed for, invasive species removal, it's super, super important. But that's kind of the main things that come to mind offhand, but I could probably come up with more if I give it some more thought.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. So then one last question here is, can you recommend a good source of information on the life history of red-headed woodpeckers?
Yeah, so the one that comes to mind that is unfortunately, I think behind a paywall, um, is the Birds of the World account. So the Cornell Lab of Ornithology publishes it's kind of like an encyclopedia of and you can type in your species. If you're associated with an institution, um, like a public education institution or, some other institutions might have access or I think they may have nonprofit subscriptions to make it a little bit more accessible. I don't think the cost is very expensive, but certainly when things are behind a paywall, it limits accessibility. So I think the Birds of the World account really has the most detailed information, and it's based on published peer-reviewed literature, which I think is really important. I do think that the red-headed woodpecker account there needs to be updated again. It was updated within the last 5 or 6 years, but I think there's going to be some more information to add to it. So, short of that, you could go to the Cornell's. If you just type in red-headed woodpecker, their just main public site will come up, and there is some basic information there, but it doesn't have the real like research sections there.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so very much. And I'm sorry to everybody that we couldn't get to all the questions, but hopefully you can reach out or continue this conversation. And now I just wanted to give us a couple outro slides, but thank you so much, Elena. It was amazing. Lots of great energy in the chat. Thank you to everybody that contributed
Welcome.
your thoughts and your questions. It has been a lively conversation, no doubt.
Thanks
So,
for being here, everyone. It was good to share.
yeah. All right. And forgive me as I get over to my stuff. Okay, so please do become a regular at these webcasts. So register for upcoming episodes. It's always on the second Wednesday of the month in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour, and we'll send you a morning reminder anytime that you register. And that is stewardshipnetwork.org/webcasts. So in February of this year, we have Slow and Steady Wins the Race, Conserving Blanding's Turtles Through Science and Stewardship with Yu-Man Lee of the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. Then in March of this year, we have Fuels to Flows, Bringing Nature-Based Stewardship to the Headwaters with Brock Dolman of Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. And then in April of this year, we have Sharing the Story of Fire in Great Lakes Forests with Evan Larson, University of Wisconsin, Platteville. And with that, thank you all so very much for being here. We really appreciate your support. We hope you have a great rest of the month and hope to see you next month. Take care.